Now, after months of anticipation and promotional TV interviews, today the world can finally get their hands on Prince Harry's new memoir, Spare.
Many have criticised Prince Harry for lambasting his loved ones and causing potential damage to the future of the monarchy, but our next guest has always been supportive of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex.
Omid Scobie, who wrote about the couple stepping down as senior royals in the book Finding Freedom, is one of the few people in the world who's already read Prince Harry's memoir cover to cover, and he joins us now to share his thoughts. Welcome. It's good to have you here today. So you have read it cover to cover. A sort of overview feeling of what you saw. Was it what you were expecting?
Yes and no. I remember when this book was first announced, they put an emphasis on it being a memoir, that it would be sort of the sophisticated, sort of elevated read that I thought maybe full of PR spin. If anything, I was surprised at just how candid Harry is, not just on the sort of realities of his existence as a member of the royal family, but also through his own personal struggles, talking about how he dealt with drugs, how he coped with things before discovering therapy. I think it's a really sort of deep look at someone that has been so misunderstood and sort of caricatured in the British tabloids, and we actually get to hear it in his own words for once.
So you got an advance copy, and we know, everybody knows that you're sort of close to them. You say you haven't met them, or have you met them?
I've met them through my job as a royal correspondent,
right,
but I haven't spent sort of personal time with them. I'm not their friend. I know the tabloids like to sort of focus on that side of it, but listen, the reality is, as covering the royals, you have certain teams that you build closer relationships to, and myself, when Meghan came on the scene, felt sort of more drawn to their story.
And so do you, the question is, with having that knowledge, there was a rumour that he wanted to pull the book, and that went around. And listen, you know, we've all been hearing so much about sources and rumours and things that are planted and lies and goodness knows what. Do you know anything about that?
I remember at the time that this sort of rumour of the book being sort of called into question, there were talks about the release date of the book. There was certainly sort of back and forth between Harry and the publisher. Obviously, the publisher wants to pick at a time where it's sort of the opportune moment to sell the most copies of the book. Harry's thinking of sort of moments that are happening in his family's life and how he can try and avoid them. So I know of those conversations that took place, but from what I've been told, there was never a moment in which Harry wanted to sort of pull back on doing this book. He was always confident that he wanted to be able to tell his story. And I think with or without a book deal, we would have been hearing from him at some point in time, just to want to put his voice on the sort of historical record of his life.
There's been a lot of criticism saying that this is an attack on the royal family. That's something you disagree with. You say there's a whole lot more to this book. And actually you go further and you say that there are similarities between this book and a book that King Charles himself penned. I mean, maybe not directly, Jonathan Dimbleby directed, but he signed it off himself. What makes you say that?
Well, of course, look, we all know Diana's involvement with Andrew Morton in '92. Of course, at the time, they didn't admit it to the world, but she was heavily involved in that. It was all based on her tapes. But of course, in 1994, Charles did exactly the same thing with BBC journalist Jonathan Dimbleby. He sat down for countless hours to talk about his life at length, candidly, but also gave access to 10,000 private letters, his journals, his diaries. This has all been confirmed on the record, and the book was based on all of that. He also opened up his contacts book to allow any of his friends or aides to speak to the author as well. And the reason for wanting to do that is Charles felt very misunderstood by the public. He felt that the sort of lens that his life had been seen through was mostly through the tabloids, and he wanted to be able to show the world who he was. And I understand that even now, looking back, there are no regrets about doing that, despite the fact this was a book that spoke about how cold that relationship was that he had with his mother, how Prince Phillip was almost a sort of bullyish character in his life that wanted him to grow up to be an aggressive leader and far from the man that he actually was. So I think it's a sort of reoccurring theme that members of the royal family feel misunderstood, that their lives are seen in a different way through the tabloids, and ultimately they want to put their voice back onto their story.
Do you think the reaction would have been different if, at that point, when that book came out, there had been social media and there had been online papers?
Well, listen, The Sun ran a poll at the time after this book had come out and after a documentary with the same journalist came out, and I think 2/3 of its readers called for Charles to not become king. They felt that he wasn't suitable for the role because he had attacked his family. There were columnists that said he should be stripped of his titles. I mean, this all sounds really familiar, right? But of course, we forget, time moves on. And I think Harry, of course, is in a less important position than his father, but we still feel as passionately about the fact that he has lifted the lid on the private world of a very sort of mysterious family that like to keep their privacy. And in many ways, we feel defensive of the royal family. We know they can't answer back to the things that he's brought up in the book. So for many, it feels as if he's sort of put them in an unfair position.
Do you think he has?
I think that he himself is in an unfair position where his life has been told by countless journalists over and over again with sort of true and untrue versions of stories, myself included. I'm one of those journalists that's written endlessly about his life and often had to rely on sources, secondhand information, friends of, ex-friends of. But you're never going to get the gospel sort of like truth from the horse's
And sorry, can I
mouth.
just ask you, when you say sources, and I know, obviously, I'm not going to ask you to reveal sources, I never would, I know you wouldn't anyway, but is that a world that you recognise this? Because there's plenty in the book about these family members leaking or briefing and most importantly, briefing against each other, sort of throwing dirt about one to sort of promote the other. Is that a world you recognise as a journalist?
It's a part of a world I recognise. I think Harry's view of it is perhaps slightly more, I guess, basic than what it actually is behind the scenes. Obviously, it's far more nuanced. But yes, of course, there is a world in which palace aides brief about other members of the family to journalists. Now, listen...
In a negative way?
Sometimes in a negative way, sometimes in a deflective way. Sometimes it's just idle gossip.
Have you been on the receiving end of those briefings?
I've been on the receiving end of briefings about other members of the royal family from aides that don't work for those members of the royal family. Now, it's not necessarily negative information, but gossip goes around the palace. They share things
we
that
hear
they shouldn't
constantly
share.
on a tiny scale, a very unimportant scale for us. You know, there'll be a story and you'll know it's not true and it'll be printed and then it'll say sources have been contacted and you know they haven't. Or a source says and you think, well, that's not anyone I know and that's certainly not come from us. So, you know, you get to learn to treat those things with an element of caution. What Harry seems to have done is to confirm that, certainly in the royal circles, that those are true, that there are people briefing against him, that there are offices working against each other, constantly trying to shuffle who is more important in the pack.
It's a popularity contest, there's no doubt about that. But I think sometimes it's also things that aren't as personal as he thinks it is. I remember one story about Harry and Meghan not getting planning permission for something in their garden, and it was splashed all over the Daily Mail at the time, and it made them look like they had done something that they shouldn't have done. There were questions over why it was a security matter, which it said in the council paperwork. I remember speaking to a palace aide at the time that said this whole thing had come from the fact that Charles had gifted them a gazebo for their garden and hadn't done the appropriate checks, or whoever was working on the project hadn't done the appropriate checks. This was a gift that Harry and Meghan had received. But when Harry and Meghan wanted to put that side of the story out there, palace aides intervened because they felt that it would have made Charles look bad. So they had to stand back and take the hit for that story, as innocuous as it sounds, but as you know, all of these things get spun into sort of something far more negative. And I think it's those experiences and the repeatedness of it that they got really fed up of. So I don't think it's always an agenda to make them look bad, but it's often a way of sort of protecting others. But of course, them in the process are the collateral damage.
There were a few, you noticed a few little mistakes in the book, and you sort of wonder, you know, if you were putting out a book like this, you want to make sure factually it is watertight because you know people are going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. There's a bit of a quibble over his location when the Queen Mother passed away, and you picked up on that. Do you think that by having those sort of within there, people will go, God, there's mistakes in this. Can this be trusted?
Yeah, what you want everything to be watertight when you go to press. But at the same time, this is someone recanting memories from way far back in their childhood, and there are going to be small discrepancies here and there. There are going to be things that family members may read and go, oh, I don't remember it like that. But ultimately, this is the version of his life that he remembers. And I think that, yes, a lot of it has been fact-checked, but clearly things have fallen through the net, just as you say, like his location when the Queen Mother passed away. Of course, he says he was somewhere else, but he was actually away on a ski trip with his father, which was, of course, heavily documented at the time.
It is that there are... Obviously, we've seen all the snippets that have been the headlines. There are parts of it which are very funny. There are parts of it that you look at and you think, and you read it in context, that you see, OK, well, that's not quite the headline that I read, which is obviously going to be the case. It's very tiny writing. There's a lot in there. But do you think there are areas here that he's made, not recollection issues, but a mistake?
No. I think from everything I've known about this story and have followed, I feel like it just fills in the gaps.
Is it going to help him moving forward?
I don't know if it's going to help with the reconciliation that he talks about, because, of course, this is now a family that, as we're hearing from royal sources in the papers today, feel that they can't trust him with any conversation moving forwards. And I don't know if he thought about that as an outcome of doing this book.
But he's actually printed text messages between Meg and Kate. And you think, well, how are you... if he was my mate, I certainly wouldn't send him anything, because you think, well, I can't trust you on that.
Yeah, and I can see how people would see that's crossing a line. But I think also at the same time, you have to remember that those text messages are in there because Palace sources originally gave a different version of that story to the world or to a journalist that ended up in print, that he's now saying, OK, here are the texts. This is what happened.
I mean, he said this book is about getting his side of the story over. You know, it's a big book. It's done. It's out there. Does that now mean the healing for himself, regardless of anybody else, has happened, and that now he will move on and this will be the last of the revelations?
Without a doubt, this must have been a cathartic process for him. And, you know, we've heard in interviews he now says that he has found peace and he's no longer angry about the things that have happened. I think they've got to be very careful over the months ahead to sort of quickly move on to the work that they moved to the US for, because what they don't want to do is end up being permanently associated with drama and the soap opera of the royal family. Sure, there's a lot of unfinished business that he deals with in this book, things that have happened in the past that he wanted to just put his voice to. But I also think that there's a point now where you've got to draw a line over it and move on, and hopefully we see that, but who knows?
Do you think, because I think you've used the words, they've got to tread carefully now from now on, do you think that interest, I mean, this would be huge, clearly, Netflix thing was enormous, viewing figures of many of the interviews he's done, certainly in America, have not been massive, so there's a point where the public themselves move on. All right, you've given us the dirty details. We've seen all of that now. Now let's move on. Do you think that there is going to be the interest for him that perhaps he expected?
I mean, from what I've heard, this book is about to break global records in terms of sales.
But moving on.
But moving on, I don't think that would happen again if there was a follow-up, because I think people want to see... Ultimately, people want to see Harry and Meghan in a happy place. They want to see them having achieved all the things that they moved to America for. And I think that they have. But I don't know if we're seeing that, because we're still all living in the past. We're still sort of going through those moments of them stepping away. It's all very 2020 still. And I think they now need to show us their lives in 2023 so we can all move on from this story that has sort of hung over us for so long.
I think we need to. Thank you. Thank you for being here very much.